Today's case is considered the most infamous and unforgettable crime in South Korean history. A case so disturbing it inspired one of the country's most iconic films, Memories of Murder. For decades, the real killer remained unidentified, while an innocent man spent more than 32 years behind bars. And when the true suspect was finally discovered years later, the truth shocked the nation. He could never be officially charged for these crimes due to the statute of limitations. In early 1986, in the rural town of Hwaseong, Gyeonggi Province, a series of assaults began to terrorize the community. This was not a city, it was farmland, rice fields, narrow dirt roads, minimal lighting, and buses that arrived only once an hour. Surveillance cameras didn't exist, and DNA testing was not yet available. Investigations relied almost entirely on eyewitness accounts. These crimes were carefully committed late at night, under the cover of darkness. On September 19, 1986, everything changed. A 72-year-old woman, Miss Lee, was found dead in a grassy field while returning home from visiting her daughter. She had been reported missing 5 days earlier. There was no evidence of sexual assault, just a brutal and unexplained murder. Then, on October 20th, 25-year-old Miss Park disappeared while waiting for a bus. Her body was later discovered beneath a sewage tunnel. This marked the beginning of what investigators would later identify as the killer's signature. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled using women's stockings, a method that would appear again and again. Money was taken, but valuables were often left behind. This was not about theft. It was about control. The location of her body and the manner of death are believed to have inspired one of the most haunting scenes in Memories of Murder. In November, a 36-year-old woman named Kim was abducted and assaulted, but managed to escape, one of the very few survivors. She described being attacked from behind, restrained with stockings, and questioned by the attacker before he turned away to steal her belongings. In that moment, she broke free and ran. She later recalled him asking chilling questions. "What does your husband do? How many children do you have?" Profilers believe these questions revealed deep resentment and envy toward the victims' families. On December 12th, 24-year-old Kwon, a young mother, was found after being missing for over 4 months. Her body showed the same disturbing patterns. Just 2 days later, 22-year-old Miss Lee was found murdered after disappearing on her walk home from the bus stop. Stockings were again used for strangulation, and signs of severe physical assault were present. By January 10, 1987, the 5th victim, 18-year-old Hong, was found. This time, investigators discovered evidence of deliberate humiliation, suggesting the killer's violence was escalating. Experts later noted a disturbing pattern. After assaulting the victims, the killer would sometimes redress them, creating false hope, only to then end their lives. On May 2nd, 29-year-old Miss Park became the 6th known victim. By now, police were heavily patrolling the area. Investigators believe they may have encountered the killer during questioning, but dismissed him because he didn't match their expectations of what a murderer should look like. For a time, the killings appeared to stop. Then, on September 7th, 1988, 54-year-old Ms. O disappeared while returning home with peaches she had bought for her husband. Her body was later found, and in one of the most disturbing details of the case, the killer used the victim's own belongings, including the peaches, reinforcing his obsession with dominance and control. Crucially, biological evidence was recovered, but at the time, technology did not exist to test it. It would sit in storage for decades. Around this period, a bus driver reported seeing a frantic man with muddy shoes late at night. A sketch was created, but without CCTV, GPS, or a national database, the lead went nowhere. Additional victims were later discovered, some matching the pattern, others not entirely, and one of these cases would result in another man being wrongly imprisoned, a truth that would not be revealed for over 30 years. It remains unclear whether the 8th and 9th cases were connected, but 2 years later, on November 15, 1990, another confirmed victim was found. This time, the victim was a 13-year-old girl returning home from school. In South Korea, late-night classes were common, and still are, meaning it wasn't unusual for students to walk home after dark. That night, she said goodbye to her friends and followed her usual route through the fields. She never made it home. She was abducted and murdered in a manner consistent with earlier crimes, using the victim's own belongings. The autopsy revealed extreme violence, with numerous wounds to her body, suggesting the killer unleashed years of suppressed rage. Investigators believed these injuries reflected urges that had been building during the 2-year gap between attacks. Crucially, biological evidence was recovered and preserved. This raised a troubling question. Could the killer truly have stopped for 2 years? Criminal profilers say no. Instead, they believe he suppressed his urges rather than eliminating them. Some serial offenders later confessed that during cooling-off periods they would return to burial sites, standing silently, reliving the emotions of the crime. Investigators believe it's highly likely the killer revisited these locations multiple times. At the time, forensic science was extremely limited. Investigators could only determine blood type, not DNA. In several cases, blood samples were misattributed. In one instance, what police believed was the killer's blood later turned out to belong to a victim's husband. This confusion led investigators to pursue suspects with blood type B, while the real killer's blood type was O, a critical mistake that would later result in the incarceration of an innocent man. Additional victims may have been connected, but to this day, police cannot say with certainty. 1994, the arrest that changed everything. In January 1994, during a freezing winter snowfall, a 19-year-old woman named Lee was found dead in the garage of a villa. 2 days earlier, her father and brother-in-law, Lee Choon-jae, had gone to police to report her missing. Lee was married, had a young son, and was known to be respectful toward his in-laws. He even assisted in searching for his sister-in-law. However, during police questioning, Lee's story began to change. His alibi didn't hold up, and he asked investigators unsettling questions. How many years do you get for sexual assault? What's the sentence for murder? Police searched his home, the same home the victim frequently visited, and found blood evidence in the bathroom that matched the victim. Under interrogation, Lee eventually confessed. According to Lee, his sister-in-law often visited to see her nephew. He noticed she always washed her hands before drinking orange juice. While she was in the bathroom, he crushed sleeping pills into her drink. After she lost consciousness, he strangled her using her own clothing. The legal battle centered on whether the murder was premeditated. Initially, Lee was sentenced to death. On appeal, the court ruled premeditation could not be proven, and the sentence was reduced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after decades of good behavior. Who was Lee Choon-jae? Born in 1963, Lee was described by family and friends as quiet, polite, and intelligent. No one suspected a violent side. He later claimed childhood trauma, including the drowning of a younger brother and exposure to neighborhood rumors of sexual assault, experiences that may have influenced his developing obsessions. During mandatory military service in 1983, Lee became a tank driver, a role profilers believe appealed to his desire for power and control. Enclosed, armed, and followed by others, he felt a sense of authority he lacked in civilian life. After his service, Lee worked at a nearby factory, located close to where many of the Hwaseong crimes occurred. In 1992, he married. Behind closed doors, his wife later described years of abuse, fear, and violent threats. She said once Lee became angry, he was uncontrollable, a different person entirely. The truth comes out. For over 30 years, the Hwaseong serial murders remained officially unsolved. In 2019, advances in DNA technology allowed police to re-examine preserved evidence. Lee's DNA was matched to multiple Hwaseong victims, including the 5th, 7th, and 9th cases. The nation was stunned. Lee, known in prison as quiet and well-behaved, was revealed to be one of the most prolific killers in South Korean history. When confronted, he initially denied involvement. But knowing the statute of limitations had expired, laws later changed for crimes after the early 2000s, Lee eventually confessed. And that revelation would expose one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in Korean history. At the time, many of these crimes were protected by a statute of limitations. In South Korea, cases that occurred before the 2000s could no longer be prosecuted once that time expired. Because Lee's crimes took place throughout the 1980s and 1990s, all 10-plus victims he murdered fell outside that legal window. This meant that unless he was convicted for killing his sister-in-law, Lee would have walked free. By then, Lee knew he could no longer be charged for those earlier crimes. That's when he decided to tell police the truth. According to Lee, he was responsible for as many as 15 murders and over 30 sexual assaults. He even drew maps showing the locations of victims who were never found. What shocked investigators most was his precision. Over 30 years later, he remembered the details of his crimes with disturbing clarity. But the most shocking twist involved the eighth victim. Lee confessed that he was responsible for the eighth murder in Hwaseong. However, more than 30 years earlier, another man had already been convicted for that crime. The case dates back to September 1988, when a 13-year-old girl was found murdered in her own home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled by hand. No stocking or weapon was used. When investigators later reviewed the location, they discovered something chilling. The victim's home was literally next door to Lee's house at the time. Instead, police arrested a 22-year-old factory worker named Yoon, who worked at a nearby oil facility. Authorities claimed that body hair belonging to Yoon was found at the crime scene. Yoon later stated that he was verbally and physically abused, deprived of sleep and food, and psychologically broken until he confessed. He recalled being forced to copy a confession letter written by police. This document was then used as key evidence in court. Yoon was sentenced to life in prison. Years later, the evidence began to unravel. Crime scene photos showed no actual body hair, only written claims in police reports, suggesting the evidence may have been fabricated. Investigators also relied heavily on blood type analysis. The suspect was believed to have blood type B, and Yoon happened to be type B as well. To police, that was enough. They also argued that because Yoon worked at an oil factory, his hands and feet were often stained black. Yet no oil residue was ever found on the victim's clothing or inside the home. Although no definitive DNA evidence tied Lee to the crime, many samples were lost or never preserved. Lee formally confessed and later testified as a witness during the retrial 32 years later, attempting to free Yoon. Yoon, who also suffers from spinal problems that affect his mobility, was believed by many to have been framed so officers could close the case and secure promotions. At the time, solving high-profile crimes often led to career advancement. With no money, power, or proper legal representation, Yoon was forgotten by society. Finally, in 2020, Yoon was found not guilty and released after spending 32 years in prison. He was only 22 years old when he was sentenced. His entire youth had been stolen. He later sued the justice system and won, receiving compensation of over $1 million. Because so much time had passed, many cases lacked DNA evidence, leaving investigators to rely largely on Lee's confessions. This has led some to question whether Lee committed all of the crimes, or whether some may have been the work of a copycat killer, which is not uncommon in high-profile cases. So the question remains, was Lee telling the full truth? Was he exaggerating his crimes, or minimizing them? We may never know. What's most disturbing is that Lee will never be legally punished for most of these murders. While he is already serving life in prison and is unlikely to ever receive parole, many believe special laws should exist for extreme criminals like him. Correctional officers have noted that Lee has caused no trouble in prison for over 2 decades, suggesting a calculated personality. He remains calm and obedient around those he believes hold power over him, revealing a deeply manipulative and cowardly nature. My deepest condolences go out to the victims and their families, many of whom only learned the truth just a few years ago, knowing that justice will never fully be served. I can't imagine the anger and pain they must feel. Let me know your thoughts on today's case in the comments.